So welcome everyone to the Washington Flower Hour. This is a collaborative simulcast with our partners in Washington and Oregon to talk about grain and regional resources. We've got a couple of different guest speakers here today, and we'll talk about some rules of the road and get started here. So what we'll cover today, do a little intro and talk a little bit about our speakers. Then we'll get into some wheat terms and definitions, some milling and flour terms, the impacts of industrialization on the grain system, and then get into some local grain stories and resources. And of course, your pressing baking questions answered by our fabulous hosts, which I'm very excited to introduce you to. So welcome everyone. If you haven't already, go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat box, your name, your affiliation, and where you're calling in from today. I just want to give a shout out to everyone joining on a Saturday. I know that it's beautiful outside in most of the Northwest right now, so I appreciate you all hunkering down and being with us. And I see a lot of familiar faces, which is also really exciting. So you can use the chat box as well to post questions throughout the hour. We may not get to everyone. And I'm going to be helping to moderate those questions, but we'll do a major Q&A session at the end. So just because your question doesn't get answered right away, don't worry. We'll have time for that at the top of the hour, towards the top of the hour. Again, we are recording this, so it will be available later. The other partners that we're working with are the California Grain Campaign and the Portland Whole Grain Bakers. So they're doing their own flour hour right now. And they're going to be recording that as well, so we'll make that all available after we aggregate the notes and get it all digitized for you. So thanks for joining us, and thanks to all of our other partners too who are in these other two states. You can see a little breakdown of who joined the session today. We've got about half of the folks calling in from California. This was on Monday, so I think we have 300 people joining across the whole West Coast right now, which is really exciting. And who's on the call? So about half of you all are, oh, Kate, I'm viewing your screen. Let's get, can you get out of the view screen, Kate Casimore? Here we go, stop participant sharing. Let me share my screen again here. There we go. So about half of the folks on the call are home bakers, and 14% are professional bakers, followed by farmers, which is actually pretty close to what we see in our Cascadia Grains conference attendees as well. So I'm going to do some intros now. You can see some of these beautiful speakers on the side of the screen, but we have Ansley Roberts, who is of Anson Mills, taking notes and who has helped organize this call with us today. Did a great job with the PowerPoint. They have also been working with the California Grain Campaign to compile a grain lexicon document, which we'll be sharing out as well. We have Mel Darbyshire, who's the head baker for Grand Central Baking, she was also our keynote speaker at the Cascadia Grains conference this past year. We have Kathrine Kehrli, the director of the Seattle Culinary Academy, who's also spearheading the Northwest Bread Bakers Group based in Seattle. And Juli Hammond, who's a 20-year baker who's worked in bakeries in the Seattle area. So another couple of rules of the road: please mute yourself if you're not talking. And if you have an immediate question that you want asked, and you can do the raise hand function down at the bottom, but otherwise the chat box is the place to post questions. Full disclaimer, we are not experts, so we are here to share our experience and our knowledge. We've gathered together on a Saturday afternoon to hang out and talk about flour and grains, and by no means do we claim to have expertise in these areas, but we're just trying to compile and offer information for you based on our own experience and knowledge. So bear with us, and if there are other things that you want to see us go deeper in depth on with future webinars, you can also send that to us in the post-webinar survey that we'll be sending out. So without further ado, I want to also introduce myself. I'm Abba Kaiser. I work with the WSUFoodSystems program, and I help to manage the Cascadia Grains conference. And I'm very excited to see what comes out of this next time here as we look at live events in general and how we can be more strategic about regionalization, especially within a regional grain movement. So That's a little bit about me, and I'm excited to be here. I'll be kind of helping prompt things along, but really we're going to turn it over now to Juli, Mel, and Kathrine, and Ansley, who's going to be taking notes. So thanks for being here. So we'll get right into what is wheat and how do all these other grains fit into it. I'm going to pass it over to Juli Hammond.
All right. Hi, everybody, and welcome. And just like you, I'm just a big bread and grain enthusiast that likes to nerd out about these kind of things, and it's fun to talk about it with other people that have the same interests. So welcome to all you that have joined. So yeah, we'll get right into like talking about wheat, and a lot of us know what wheat is, but you know, when we think about wheat, what does it come down to? What is it? It's actually a type of grass, and we'll talk about this definition a little bit later. But we refer to these grasses as land races, and it's a French term that basically means like territory. So if you imagine thousands of years ago, and you just had different grasses growing in all these different regions. Well, at some point, humans saw some of these grasses and saw the seeds that were popping off the top of them, and cultivated some of these ones that they found that they could make food from. In the beginning, it was kind of like, okay, we're just eating the whole grains. And later it came to, oh, hey, look at, we could pulverize these grains with a stone and we could start making breads and there's so many different species and varieties of these land races of wheat. And a specific one that we use today, I believe it's called Triticum. Is that correct, Mel? But the Triticum variety is it's a higher in gluten, and it allows us to make things like bread. If you're unfamiliar with gluten, gluten is a substance that it wants to bind to itself, and so when we make bread with it, it's able to capture the carbon dioxide from the fermentation. So this kind of wheat was cultivated, and we see so many different varieties today. And so as the slide's saying, it has over 200,000 varieties worldwide. Think about the landrace varieties that are extinct today. Because if we're only cultivating that many, think of how many regionally around the world at some point existed. I always think that that's kind of cool. And there's some people that, you know, actually try to bring back some of those old ones that they're finding. I mean, not from millions of years ago. Those ones aren't really around anymore. But maybe in the last 100, 500 years, they're able to bring some of these back. So when the wheat is growing, if you look at the picture, you see that it has this kind of husk around it and a chaff, and each one of those little seedlings is commonly referred to as a wheat berry. So if you hear people say, you know, I need to get some wheat berries, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about just those little seeds, and they can vary in appearance and size and length, and also the color of that wheat berry, how big it is, how much bran surrounds it, and overall the color and the flavor. And I'm sorry, there's a number of people that probably have seen wheat berries that have not been milled, but they look, if you've ever seen something similar to like maybe a barley seed, it looks pretty similar. But let's see. So there are over 30,000 wheat varieties and 14 species grown throughout the world. 3 of those kind of old world include spelt, einkorn, and emmer. And our modern wheats, that's under the Triticum, they're kind of a mix of all 3 of those. They're a hybrid of spelt, einkorn, and emmer. And so those 3 varieties, those kind of old world varieties, we start to see a lower amount of gluten. So you see a lot of popularity with people with gluten intolerances. They'll often refer to some of those old world wheats or ancient grains because they are lowering gluten, and for people that has sensitivities, it often works better with them. So let's see.
Great, thanks, Julie. And we have another slide here about the wheat. And I'm wondering if you can also talk a little bit about the difference in baking uses for these different wheats.
Yeah, are you talking about kind of like the red wheats and?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so we have, you probably hear many different things about the wheat. You probably heard hard red, winter, hard white. And all of those have to do with the actual texture of the kernel itself, the berry. Also the color. You know, some of the, when you hear hard white, that means when it's milled, it's usually a bright white. The red winter, you probably see it has more of a kind of a brownish red color when it's milled. So we have the hard red spring. It's kind of a hard brownish color, but we see these milled more in like Washington, Oregon, Montana, some of like the northern regions, but we also see it on the coast of California being milled as well. And as far as, I had some information. Oh, hold on one sec. I had some notes in how some of these were commonly used.
Definitely. And I also wanted to just say while we're have a little break, I'm going to post a link in the chat, which is a glossary to use throughout this call to follow along with what we're talking about. And it has some working definitions of the different varieties and how they're used. Mel, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I can fill in some gaps here. So, you know, a lot of these, like the hard reds and the hard whites and the softs, you know, they're grown quite abundantly in our region, and there's a lot of different varieties of wheat within those classifications, and we'll probably get into that a little later in the PowerPoint. But oftentimes for bakeries who are doing, you know, artisan style bread, we're generally looking at using the spring wheats because they're a little higher in protein. But what we've seen historically, especially in the last 10 to 15 years in our region, is that some of the winter wheats, the varieties that are being grown, both east side and west side of the Cascades, are coming in with these proteins that are, you know, medium high, like, you know, anywhere from like 10 to 11.5, which historically in bread production would be like poo-pooed as being good bread flour, but what we're finding is they're actually quite good for bread production. And so that's, you know, as we evolve and we become better bakers, and there's more push on highlighting what's available in our region, we find that we can use some of these different varieties that we may have learned 10, 15, 20 years ago weren't good for particular styles of baking. Now you can actually make really lovely bread, and I think that's to do with some of the growing practices and quality of protein.
Yeah, like when you kind of hear like hard reds or hard whites, you could think of that'd be a good application would be for breads. And when you start hearing things like soft reds, soft whites, those are usually lower in protein, and you'd want to use those things for like scones or cakes or things, because if you imagine if you're using a product, a flour that has a high protein, but you're making a muffin with it, more gluten is going to make a real tough muffin, right? And no one wants a tough muffin or a cookie. You can use some nice lower protein flours for those kind of applications.
Great. And I'm wondering if we should talk a little bit about the landrace and heirloom and heritage and modern, those sort of definitions. So moving on to what do all these terms mean? What is this stuff?
So, you know, like I was saying in the beginning, the land races are referred to as like all the different kinds of grasses. And then you have your heirloom varieties. And when we start thinking about heirloom varieties, we're thinking about the ones that we have cultivated and kept these certain properties about them each time we grow it. We try to keep the properties. It's intentional. And then we have ancient grains. And when you think of ancient grains, you're thinking of like rye and emmer and spelt. These are some of those old world flours that we are talking about, those old world wheats. I know that it, in the kind of modern times, I've been a little irritated seeing that how advertisers have kind of abused the word ancient grains and use it kind of as a marketing term. But otherwise, you know, same with kind of like when I hear the word artisanal, when they're advertised like that. But basically, it's, you know, talking about those old world wheats. And then when we start talking about the modern wheats, the old world wheats have more chaff on the seeds, and it makes it much harder to mill them because they have to go through several processes to beat them down and to remove the chaff and the bran. And with more of the modern wheats, it's much easier to harvest them. Mel, do you want to contribute to more of kind of modern wheat?
Yeah, because some of the, so there's like, you know, there's the reality of some of these names for how we categorize the wheats. And then there is, like Julie was saying, marketing. And, you know, modern wheats are, you know, they somewhat get a bad rap these days because everyone thinks of modern wheat being the evil dwarf wheat that was, you know, developed for high gluten and, I mean, I guess yield somewhat, but basically easier to harvest and clean. But there's a lot of breeding happening all over the country, and especially in our region, where we're breeding modern wheats right now. And what's beautiful about that is we're breeding modern wheats for place, right? So wheats that they may have some old varieties in them and new varieties that carry certain attributes that are beneficial to the farmer and also agronomically where they're being grown. And that's actually a good thing because, you know, some varieties of wheat are grown out of place, you know, just because they have a name that has this legacy, like Red 5, for example, grows really well in Canada because of the environment. But on this side of the Cascades, Red 5's horrible. You know, it still tastes great, but you only get like 20 bushels or whatever per acre. So, you know, for me, the modern wheats are things that are being bred and developed. Probably we're looking at 50 years, and they still carry some of those traits of the, you know, the mother wheats. And I think modern wheats are going to be the future, especially when we're looking at regional grain economies, because it's all about breeding for what does well where you live based on your weather, climate, soil, and then I guess later infrastructures in place to actually get that grain to market.
Great.
Yeah, and I also think it's really great about like the kind of like how technology and science has really helped and like able to help other farmers communicate with each other, and then you have the scientific data to better analyze what's working.
And Kathrine, do you want to jump in here and talk a little bit about identity preserved and that definition?
Yeah, sure. When I'm thankful to see Terry right here from Shepherd Grains Farm. Hi, Terry. I have sort of two ideas around identity preserved, and I don't know if that's consistent with what you're experiencing out as home bakers or millers or commercial bakers. But there's the one sort of technical definition of identity preserved being the designation of that grain specifically. It's often given to bulk commodities that are marketed in a manner that isolates and preserves their identity throughout the shipment process. that preservation is because of unique characteristics that grain has, things that could be lost if it wasn't otherwise preserved. When you go to the Community Grains website for California, which I think this one little enterprise has made quite a showing for themselves in terms of both the romanticism of connecting to a specific grain, but also this opportunity to connect to the farmer, that I feel as if the classic definition doesn't necessarily speak to the grower specifically. And I'm wondering, as this resource glossary continues to develop, if there's a combination or a different designation when you're also linking to, as Shepherd Grains does, that direct to the farmer sort of transparency piece of that preservation. So I'm sharing that. I know Carn Springs is also working to be able to have that kind of transparency. And I think that the identity, for me, identity preservation comes out of a desire to have increased transparency in the food system and the grain thread. It also is an invitation then for home bakers and for commercial bakers to deepen their relationship with the growing practices that are happening out in the field. So while I am not at all an expert on the range of farmers out there where we can connect with, I love the work that Cascadia Grains is doing to foster a connection with those direct resources so that you can be selective. You can choose your grains with a level of knowledge or respect for how they were grown or selected, including if they were grown and selected as a modern race, as Mel and Julie were just talking about, or if they were grown and selected as a land race, but you would have the ability to know and understand that. And the current food system and commodity system doesn't always allow us to do that.
Great, thank you, Kathrine. Mel and Julie, anything else you want to add to the whole definitions and terms? It looks like we have this beautiful slide that talks about the whole grain versus white flour, which we'll get to in a second. But is there anything else you want to say about the definitions? And I also want to mention that the Google Doc, which I'll share again, has all these written down as well for everyone.
I'd like to offer that the identity preserved, like for me, as I've kind of been immersed in getting involved with local farms and mills, is it's created that connection that we never used to have before. Being outside the commodity market, where you can learn the variety of wheat that's being grown, which field, which farm it's being grown. You can talk to the miller, and so I think that traceability and identity preserved actually, it perpetuates and nurtures the connection that's so important, I think, as we move forward and kind of what we're all seeking as we're on this path together. So, I don't often get hooked onto varieties per se, like they tell a good story, but identity preserved for me is that, like that connection where you can, we can, for most of the flour we use, I know the farm, the mill, I can find out where it was grown. I can have conversations about it, and that builds connection and community.
Awesome. Well said. Let's move on to talk about the different nuances of whole grain flour compared to what's known as more conventional flour. We'll talk about the difference and why does it matter. We've got Julie and Kathrine up on this slide, and we'll talk a little bit about milling and the differences between the different kinds of mills.
All right, so yeah, in the picture you have your wheat berry, and how I like to describe a wheat to people is I think of like an egg. You have your egg white, your egg shell, and you have your egg yolk. And I like to think of it the same way as like a wheat berry. Your middle, your yolk, is your germ, and then you have your white of your egg would be considered like the endosperm on a wheat berry, and the bran would be the shell. And each has a specific amount of nutrients. So the germ, you have all these like natural oils, and when it's activated, it reaches into the endosperm. That's where all the carbohydrates and sugars are, and it gets its initial food source, just like when a chick is starting inside the shell. And then the bran is like the protective cover, and it's all like fibers and minerals. You may have heard of a term called like patent flour. They have different grades of milling. And the patent flour, if you look at the endosperm, it's like the very center of the endosperm. It's like most clearest and whitest. It doesn't really have any nutrient properties to it. It's all like carbohydrates and sugar. That's what they're looking for. And so the difference between the two, so you got white flour, which is all endosperm. And when that breaks down, that's all sugar. When you are milling with whole grain and using whole grain, you get all of them with the oil, you get the bran. And there's just a lot of evidence showing that eating or consuming all of those together are more beneficial than just getting the big gut bomb of white flour. And yeah, so there's I don't know where I'm going from here.
That's great. That's great.
Mel, do you want to?
Kathrine,
or
you
Kathrine?
Too about the difference, and maybe share some of those links that you had prepared in the chat box.
Yep, I absolutely will. And just to dovetail a little bit off of Juli, and I'm putting a couple links here, and I want to give a shout out to Tafoni Bakehouse, who was the original share of these links with me. I am sharing this bench analysis. So yeah, more and more research is showing that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And in milling, we've had somewhat of a reductionist model, and we just take that patent flour as out of just the sweet spot of the endosperm. And yes, while delicious, can cause health problems for a population who's not getting the benefits of the other parts of that flour. And I thought what I would share with you that maybe you've seen before is a bench test conducted by Scott Mangold of the Bread Farm up in the Skagit. And he did this in association with the Washington State University. So the first link that I'm sharing is, and I'll hold it up because I don't think it's in the slide, but it's, I think it's very informative on the effects of processing wheat on nutrient density. So I probably don't have to sell you all on fiber. We know that we're not getting enough fiber. There's a lot of research on its beneficial effects on our gut biome. But I'm wondering if you understand how much of the good stuff is still in the flour, even if it's just minimally extracted. So whole grain is whole grain, and it's got the most benefits. But as you look through, when you extract the flour, say by 88%, so that could be a good stone milling process, it's still retaining 80% of the calcium, 79% of the iron, 67% of the magnesium, and 83% of the fiber. So you're not really losing that much in that high extraction compared to much more dramatic losses for an enriched white wheat flour, where now you're down to the 40% or the 30%, and only in the iron category because of the enrichment does it jump back up. So I thought that was, I find this to be informative and interesting and validating for those of you who try to navigate just whole wheat. It might give you more flexibility in your bread formulas and comfortability to use some high extraction flours. Or if you're still using only highly processed bread flours, it might give you a little nudge towards experimenting with more stone milled flours, or moving through the range or the continuum.
That's great. And on that stone mills, let's just go right to the next slide, and we can talk a little bit about the different kinds of mills that are out there. Ansley, if you want to jump in here too, and I know Julia's got some knowledge here as well to share.
Hey y'all. So my name's Ansley Roberts. I work with Anson Mills. We're a small artisan mill based out of South Carolina. So I know that's confusing, but I'm here on a Washington call. I also work with the California Grain Campaign, and I am currently on the West Coast. Full disclosure, I am not the miller. So just putting that out there. This is not full milling school. Just wanted to give a really brief overview of the differences that you might see in how grain is milled. So we had that really great picture in the last slide of your bran, your endosperm, and your germ. And so this first type of mill is stone milling. It's the oldest form of milling we have. I am really biased because we use stone mills. You can see here in the diagram that the grain goes through the chute, and then you have a bed stone that rests, and you have your runner stone that's rotating, and the grain is both pushed out and crushed as it goes through the mill. And in that process, you're retaining the whole grain. And if you're looking for more of like what you would consider a white flour when you're using a stone mill, it goes through what's called a bolter or a sifter. And depending on what you want your end use to be, if you want more of like a finer flour for cakes, you're gonna sift more versus less. Or there are also a lot of stone millers who don't sift at all. Depends on your preferences. So if you go to the next slide, and actually we can check in with Mel and Juli and Kathrine after this. I'm not sure. I know there are mills here that finish with stones, which I'll talk about in a second. I don't know if there's anybody in Washington who's straight stone milling. And then another common form of mill you'll see is a hammer mill. Same kind of vertical processing. Your grain goes in the top, and then you have these small hammers basically that are kind of slicing and dicing the grain through this process, and then the finer grain comes out the bottom. It's still kind of a whole grain system. You're processing all as one unit, and you can, I'm not as familiar with hammer mills. I know Fairhaven Mill is a hammer mill. And if you have further questions about hammer mills, people to talk to. And then if you go to the next slide, we have roller mills, which are, when people say industrial milling, that's generally the kind of processing that you're looking for. So like this diagram is a very complicated system that you would see in an industrial mill. Not all roller mills are this scale or processing this way. So not all roller mills are created equally. You can see here even just the scale of like what comes in, like a whole barge of grain. Like that's a lot of grain. And roller mills are you're scalping the bran and the germ out through, basically they're going through two circles like that, and they're scalping it out. And then they have the option to sift back in, or they sift and they have the option to incorporate back in. And that's where I was talking about finishing with stone mills. Cairn Spring up in Skagit Valley finishes with stone mills. And basically they're reincorporating that bran. I'm not sure if they're reincorporating germ. I think Mel knows more about that than I do.
I think they're because so in this milling system here, there's like I don't know how many rollers, but there's a lot of rollers, and I think Cairns only has 4. Maybe with the new mill they have more. I think they only have 4 breaks, and they do these massive mills like this. They temper pretty aggressively because they really want that first. The goal of these mills is for efficiency and to get the widest flour as fast as possible with minimal labor. So they want to temper the wheat so that softens the outside layer, so they can almost peel it off on that first break, because then they get to sift it faster and separate it into all their different pots. And the cairn spring, which is more, I think it's a Danish style mill, Kathrine, right? I think. So I think there's 4 breaks, and they do temper a little bit, but just so they can break off some of the larger bran. And so the germ, if they're doing good milling practices, a lot of the germ stays intact through those 4 breaks, and then they incorporate some of those siftings back in and finish everything on the mill. So they're able to get a really high extraction flour that's got a really nice fine mill. So it's really good for baking application. You can literally replace it for white flour. Like there's some adjustments you have to make, but it's not like going from white flour to whole grain flour, although some whole grain flours, if they're milled really well, you can sub them out with more tweakings. So on the Cairn Springs, he's keeping more of that nutritional value through the process into the end, and there's more fiber in it. There is not as much fiber as whole grain, because he's doing he's doing 85 extraction rates. So, he's sifting off, 10 to 15% of the larger bran particulate. But that's it's kind of like they use these mills in Europe, I think, because they want to have more nutritional value in the flour, and that adds flavor and benefits to the consumer. Yes, this would be a smaller roller mill in this graphic right here. I don't know where this is, but I think Hillside Grain has a similar type of setup where it's part roller, part stone mill combination.
Yeah, and those boxes on the top are sifters or bolters. It's the screens that the flour is going through so that you get finer particulate at the end.
Yeah, I know you guys have heard us mention extraction a lot, but for those of you that don't know, it's just a term that we use, like say if you put 1 pound of wheat berries in a mill and you grind it, and then you do some sifting, and what you're left with is 75%. That's what we're talking about when we talk about extraction. So when you talk about different percentages of extractions, that's all it really is. So yeah, like Mel was talking about, some of the procedures as part of milling, like the sweating time, the cleaning, the tempering, and also the roll settings that are used on the different mills, the extraction rate, and then like the last part of it is like the natural or the chemical aging of that flour after it's milled, because it needs to be aged. It's similar to like wine. When we squish the grapes down, get the juice, it's really nice and sweet in the very beginning, but after about a week, it gets kind of funky. So then you got to wait, a little bit more time, and then it gets good again. Well, flour is the same way. It has to go through a process of maturing before you use it. You can use fresh flour right away, but you have to use it, pretty quick before it turns. And then after it's matured, it can be used again.
Great, thanks, Julie. Yeah, I know there's a lot of conversation around fresh flour, which I think is really an interesting conversation to get into. I do want to make sure that we have some time for questions at the end and some discussion. So I want to move on to the impact section of our presentation here. And again, if anybody has questions, please just post them through the chat and we'll get to them at the end, and maybe have some time for discussion as well. So we're going to talk a little bit about the impacts of industrial milling and the wheat industry. Julie and Mel are going to tag team this. I have relatively little to offer from my experience with Cascadia Grains, but we'll talk through some of the hip terms right now in agriculture, no-till, organic, regenerative, things like that. So if Mel, do you want to kick us off here?
Yeah, I'll do and just disclaimer, I am not a historian, but it was quite fascinating to do some reading into the history of roller mills in America and in the world. Most of as we were talking about earlier, most of the grain used to be processed through stone mills pretty much worldwide. And even back then, there was still this desire to get the white flour. There was value in that. And so there was sifting happening historically. In some ways, there's evidence of like cloth being used or burlap sacks to sift out some of the white stuff. But as we evolved, and I think in the 1860s was the time when there started to be a little more mechanization brought into milling in Europe and in America. And the reason was that they've been playing with the stone milling to try and get higher extraction, more white stuff. And so it kind of spurred this innovation on how to do it more efficiently. So the roller mills were basically designed to efficiently separate the bran and the germ, so that you just have the white flour left, the endosperm. This offered several advantages in the milling trade because it eliminated costs. You had to constantly dress the millstones. It allowed for a slower, gradual extraction, making the grade of the flour better, regardless of wheat quality. And it created a more uniform product. But basically the goal of the roller mills was to take the grain and mill it efficiently into white flour as this premium product. The downside is once you do that, it becomes devoid of nutrient value. I mean, yes, there's protein in there and there's carbohydrates, but a wheat berry in itself is almost perfect. It's like perfect nutrition bomb. Everything is in there. So now we've taken that all away and we've created this white substance. So I think in 1860, the first mill was invented in Hungary, and then later in America, Oliver Evans invented the first rolling mill here, and some of the first big mills in this country were built in Middle America because there was distribution along the Mississippi, so they could get the barges of grain. And I just found out, I think this is funny, I think Minneapolis was called like Silicon Valley of grain, which is kind of interesting to think about that. Just hold on 1 second. Once these roller mills became more popular in the second half of the 19th century, the stone mills gradually got phased out because they became pretty much redundant, because as Industrial Revolution was happening, we were getting more into processed food. So everything kind of synced up to where now we needed this flour wicked fast and really white. And then that kind of bled into the industrial bread making, which was, again, England developed the trolley wood, which was basically you take this white flour that was devoid of nutritional value but now has these enrichments added, and you take away all the fermentation and you throw a bunch of chemicals in there and you mix it in this massive mixer, extrude it, and that was the birth of Wonder Bread. And it was super exciting in that time, but also historically now we look back, a really kind of devastating hit to health and nutrition, not only in this country but worldwide, by this big push for refined foods. To give you an example of mills, like back in the early days, there used to be about 22,000 or more mills in America, and there's less than 200 left. And most of the milling in this country, it's owned by 3 or 4 big companies. So you're thinking of the Car Hills, ADM, I kind of blocked off some of those bigger, but so that's where we've become, and that came about from this the roller mill invention, which kind of led into how agriculture evolved. You go back to the Dust Bowl days and this monocrop planting of wheat in America, in places where wheat probably shouldn't be grown, but it was all to feed this big industrial food system, and it came at heavy cost to agriculture and people's lives and farms. And I think we haven't recovered from that.
Yeah, and I think that's a great segue to talk about kind of some of the farming practices. And I know there are a lot of farmers on the call right now who are deeply involved in this conversation, but just as a baker and thinking about this end use, and how these different farming practices kind of affect the price point, affect the quality, affect your values, and how that kind of all weaves in together there.
Yeah, I mean it's tough out there, talking to different farmers and millers, and kind of going by what Mel was talking about. There was such a need to feed America and do it where both everybody was making some money and everybody was getting fed. And so the problem was, you were trying to find like what are the cheapest methods that we can produce this. Otherwise, if we didn't hit this industrial revolution, what would have been the cost of that? Kind of seeing both sides of the coin. There was this need to feed, but then, what are the repercussions and how do we fix that from here? Farmers that I've talked to say that, it's hard having a small amount of land to work with. And because you have to think about distribution, where's your closest mill at, and kind of tagging on what Mel was saying, like a lot of these mills closed. Back in the day, even the smallest town, every town had its own mill, and people would bring their grains there and get it milled. And now you don't have that anymore. So that kind of shut down those kind of jobs and that commerce locally. And so you're having to hit the commodity market, and just like the stock market, it's prices fluctuate, and that can be hard for farmers to kind of make those tough choices, like do I spray my fields? But I'm hearing there's a popularity, like a movement of people that want organic. But in order to do that, I have to give up this, and I'm not going to make as much money, and I might lose my farm. And so these are a lot of things to think about, and how that affects. So I don't know what the answer is, but I do know that there are a lot of people out there that are making the connections and are joining groups like this, and joining conferences to kind of network together and to come up with some ideas of how everybody can win from this. But also what the main idea is, like, how can we bring nutrition back?
And I do want to move into nutrition really quickly before we hear about just more about your all's individual stories and that connection to the wider movement. And I just want to kind of summarize that section about the agricultural position that we're in with agriculture as small farm and medium scale farmers. No-till can mean that you have to use some Roundup. Organic might mean leave the soil barren, and make you dependent on the fossil fuel industry. There's a lot of choices that you have to make, and there's no silver bullet. And I think everybody who's here is invested in that conversation of trying to understand the economic and ecologic impact of this movement, and hopefully that it's delicious in the end. So we're going to just briefly touch on nutrition. Kathrine, I'm wondering if you can just post those resources in the chat, because we're very short on time and I want to make sure that we get to your stories. So if there's anything just real briefly you want to say about these links that you're sharing, that would be great. And then we'll launch into just our stories in general.
Looks like you're on mute, Kathrine.
can easily be brief because I'm confident you are all aware that using the whole grain is going to be more nutritious and beneficial. And then it's striking your balance. The links that I'm sharing with you underscore that connection. And we do want people to be healthy. It affects our medical system. It affects our food supply. We are now, COVID is preying on those who are the most vulnerable health-wise, and your likelihood of being able to survive is related to what other comorbidities you have, if you have diabetes, if you have heart disease. And so we know these things, and we are not going to beat this wheat. We're not going to thrash it. But some of these things may be helpful as you navigate for your businesses, for your family diets, whatever it is.
Great. Awesome. So we just had a quick question about sifted flour nutrition and the sifted flour nutrition study, and wondering if that's on those links that you shared, Kathrine.
It is.
Okay, great.
That's exactly what I shared. Yep.
Awesome. Great. So we knew this would happen. We're almost out of time, but if we could just hear just a little bit of everybody's story, and we've got just a few questions, so we will definitely have time in the last minute or so here to answer them. And actually, why don't we just get to the questions right now? So before we get into the stories here, but maybe it's a real quick answer, but why are spring wheats higher protein generally? Lisa Crawford wanted to know. Does anybody know that?
Is that because they're generally lower yield, right? So in fact, if there's some farmers on here who probably might have a better answer, but I think they're lower yield, so they end up with higher protein. I also think they also take more nitrogen too, which affects protein. So I don't know if it's a combination of farming practices and or yield impact. But
I mean, that would make more sense. It's providing most of its energy into making that protein.
Great. Does anybody else on the call have any input there on the spring wheat question, and that they want to post in the chat? Or any other questions that you want to share for the last couple minutes here? Like I said in the beginning, we're not experts for sure. So we might go a few minutes over, but I just wanted to give folks a chance to, Juli and Mel and Kathrine, just a chance to talk about their relationship now with the regional grain movement and where they see how they've kind of gotten to this point and where they see it going. And a soundbite really is what we're looking for. So Juli, do you want to kick us off here?
Oh yeah, my involvement in the past with what has been going on is just as a baker and enthusiast is going to the conferences and making connections with people, but as a baker, as a commercial baker, inspiring the new bakers, educating them on what resources are out there for them to learn, and to how to be involved, especially for the younger bakers out there. It's like, hey, you should, it's something as simple as like, hey, you should go to this conference, or maybe you should go to Bread Lab and take this class that's being put on by Mel and the crew, and kind of like learn about what they're doing with the community. And so a little bit about me is, like I said, I've been baking for 20 years, and how it all kind of started was I started as a donut fryer when I was 18 at Top Foods, and I just kept working my way up, and we would have people from Puratos come in and kind of do demos in there, and I'd connect with them, and I'd be like, I really want to get into baking. And I actually first started in pastry with Essential Baking Company, and I was doing pastry chef, and then I just wanted to get into bread. And at that time, it was a very kind of male-dominated atmosphere, and I was kind of held back in both the pastry area and the breads, where I had people on both sides going, no, you should stay where you're at. women are better in pastry. And it wasn't until I went to Columbia City and I kind of explained to everybody about, hey, I know I'm a woman, but I want to show you how I'm such a hard worker. And Evan there kind of was like, looked at me inquisitively and took me to the back, and it was all women bakers back there. So it was just the environment that had kind of held me back. And I continued working with different bakeries. I'd learn something new each time. Like I met Scott Mangold at Bread Farm, and he would tell me about this type of fermentation where he wasn't doing a pre-shape before his final shape. And I was like, it just blew my mind. I was like, oh, how you could save money. I wanted to see how that affected the flavor. So I became his head baker there. Later on, becoming an instructor for King Arthur Flour, did some teaching for a little bit before I worked for Starbucks. Kind of worked for the corporate baking area for that time, and realized there's a lot of technology that I kind of lacked out on because I was working with my hands for so many years. So now, thinking about creating a sustainable bakery, I'm actually going back to school now, learning kind of business and accounting on how to create a sustainable model to hopefully open a bakery in the future.
Awesome. Thanks, Julie. That's rad. I feel like we could spend the whole time hearing each other's stories. Maybe we'll do that. Mel, do you want to just share briefly?
Yeah, a lot of you have already know my story. Started as a dishwasher, blah, 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 in Grand Central. Immersed myself into flour on the heels of a wheat market crash. That's when we started using shepherd's grain. And to me, when I first started becoming passionate about flour as an ingredient, I baked for maybe 6 or 7 years, and it just came. To now where I am, where I've built these relationships over the last 12, 15 years to do more, you know, and finding places where Grand Central can purchase direct, help startup companies, and, you know, basically, you know, chip away at our commodity flour. We still do contracts. There's a fine line there because you can save money, and cash flow allows us to purchase some products at a higher price point. So it is a dance, but where we are right now, obviously with the COVID situation, is we, you know, 50% drop in sales. We rallied and pivoted like crazy, basically to save the company. When you have restaurants being 50 to 55% of your income, and they all close within a week, that's really catastrophic. And even though Grand Central is considered big, we run on pretty tight margins because we do a lot of investment, not only into our food and sourcing, but our employees. So we rallied, and I rewrote the production, what we should make and what we could make with limited staff. And it worked out, and we were able to stabilize and save the company pretty much. During that horrible time, probably one of the most stressful times in my career, because we laid off folks and took pay cuts and all that business, we were able to focus on some R&D projects that we weren't able to pull off well because we were so busy. And basically we're still working and pushing that envelope on bringing in more flour from from Cairn Springs, Camas, working with Smalls Farms from Walla Walla, to try and bring in more of his flour. He's thinking about putting in a mill, which would be really brilliant to have another mill choice in our region. And he would be doing, you know, white flours, but also a mill that could do high extraction flours too. And I just think the more choices, the better. So we've been able to chip away at getting some of those projects out. We've just launched in Seattle one with Seth, where we're pulling in 32 bags of flour a week from him for a project. And I've got another project launching next week where we'll increase our purchasing from Cairn Springs. Obviously, some of the mills took hits, right? Because we have big customers products were built for them based on some of these relationships. So, you know, it's been tough, but when you're in tough times, there's always areas for opportunity. And that sounds a little cliche, but what we're doing is we're looking at kind of setting and Grand Central probably won't be the same Grand Central it was, and maybe that's not a bad thing. We have this opportunity to really reassess our products, what we want to be known for, reinventing products and bringing them back with more local flour, possibly. Like it's kind of not quite a blank canvas, but that's kind of where we are right now, as well as obviously keeping the bakery alive, keeping our employees safe, keeping ourselves safe for our families, and hopefully opportunities like this so I can continue to inspire folks. I think what Juli said is, it's like, if we can inspire the next generation, this momentum we're on will carry on with the next wave of bakers who basically are growing up in the industry so much more in a better place than we were 15 years ago, because some of those little infrastructure pieces that have been missing are coming back. It's still not perfect, but I guess that's all I've got to say.
Nice, Mel. Thank you so much for sharing. And I know we're at time, but I wanted to give Kathrine a few minutes to share about her story and the work that she's doing with the Seattle Culinary Academy and the Northwest Bread Bakers.
Thank you. And I do know that we're out of time, but I am first and foremost a passionate and enthusiastic bread baker, and I feel as if I found this passion late in the game. I have been really all in for the last 5 years. In my professional hat, I do serve as the Dean of the Seattle Culinary Academy, which has vocational technical programs in both specialty desserts and breads and the culinary arts. Because of the bread passion that was ignited for so many reasons, but I think for the same that you all share, it's just really the chemistry and magic of those 4 simple ingredients: flour, water, salt, yeast. And every single time it just blows me away. And every time I learn more and layer on more, I'm still all in. That passion I wanted to see, I experienced in the community of the grain gathering hosted up at the Wazoo Bread Lab, and I got the privilege to attend that 3 years in a row before they moonlighted it for some other efforts. And that also the spirit and camaraderie of that event that brought farmers and millers and bakers of a wide range of skill set together just motivates and excites me. And I wanted to keep that conversation going throughout the year. And as a result, formed a community group called Northwest Bread Bakers. Northwest Bread Bakers is essentially a made up of home bakers, serious bakers, small micro bakeries, large bakers, anybody who's enthusiastic about bread who would like to meet as part of a community, talk about best practices, learn new tips and tricks, meet farmers, resource share. And we've been doing that for the last 2.5 years, maybe now. And this, and we're growing. So we're like 400 members in size, and you can find us on Meetup, and you can find us on Facebook. And most recently, I feel like you can find us now on Instagram. We're trying to get our social media sea legs, but we're just a grassroots organization doing our part around local grains. I do want to say one thing about the local grain conversation, which was not only is it grown for place, but also for flavor. And I think that one of the things that is helping home bakers and enthusiastic bakers connect with farmers is realizing that flour has flavor and grains can impart variety to your baked goods, whether you're milling those grains yourself or finding them from a local miller. And the last thing I want to share in this fractionated time is that the Northwest Bread Bakers recently launched a community project out of the tremendous demand being faced at local food pantries. In my neighborhood, that includes HopeLink, and they are providing 3,000 boxes of food a week to families. And that's just a small slice of the demand that's out there. Our group and organization is creating community loaves. Here's an example of it. And these really are coming from home bakers. We have info sessions every Wednesday, and we're recruiting a home baking army. We will help you with the formula. We will help you get supplies and materials. We will even help get those items picked up from the loaves picked up from you. If you want to know more about it, you can find that information also on our Facebook page and our meetup, or you can email me at any time. We would love to have your support and interest if you would like to contribute. It's a small effort. Again, it's not a commercial bakery. We are really just giving home bakers an opportunity in a way to make a contribution where we know it's really a tough time.
Awesome. Thanks, Kathrine. And I also just posted in the chat a link to the Neighbor Loaves Initiative, which is a voluntary program that's happening nationally. This slide is also showing a lot of the other partners across the nation who are doing a similar work to what we're talking about here, which is building regional economies, talking about sustainability. We also have other groups who are making interactive maps. This is just one of them. From Artisan Grains Collaborative. You can check out their website. We'll send out all these links after the call as well. And then other questions or other resources that are available through the Whole Grain Connection list that Monica Spiller has been putting together. So tons of resources out there for all of you. And I knew we were going to go over, so I appreciate everybody sticking around. And if you want to hang out and chat for a little while longer, you're welcome to do so. We'll leave it open. But if you have to get out there to the sun, we understand too. Folks have been communicating through the chat, which is great. We can continue to do that, and I'll just leave it open for another 10 minutes if we want to hang out and just discuss. I saw that there was some items here about soil health, which is really important. Some resources going around in the chat box. So if anybody wants to unmute themselves and ask a question or just stay on and chat, you're welcome to do so.
I also want to add, when this COVID thing is all over, I know I speak for a lot of people here. I don't want this to end. And how do we continue to stay connected, and how do we build from this? How do we continue to support each other? And whether it's continuing to meet like this, or what Kathrine's doing, it's just beautiful. It just makes me cry. It's just such a great thing on being able to share bread with people, and also people in need. So if you guys have ideas, throw them out there, but just stay involved and encourage your friends and family. Maybe if you know how to make bread, maybe you're teaching others around you, your neighbors, or even your kids, grandkids, over Zoom or in person. But just let's not end.
Yeah, it would be really sad if this momentum, this movement of home bakers having to source regional grains because the commodity system is broken, as we know, that goes away once things reset. Like I think this move, everybody on this chat and what's happening in the West Coast right now, if we're gonna change, and we're never gonna take over the commodity system, but we can chip away at it. We have to keep doing what we're doing, and that's making, supporting the farms and the mills and as much as we can. And that will help drive everything. It'll help drive more money to the farmers. Eventually prices will plateau so that it isn't a luxury item to buy local flour, right? So it's more accessible for people. Because that again is another part of, we didn't get into the economics, but having nutritional food be affordable, right? And affordable for broad spectrum of people on different income levels. And yeah, we have to take this opportunity to make change. We can change what the new normal is whenever we get back to whatever that is. And so important work to be done still.
Absolutely. Well said. Yeah, and hopefully